I started driving the 87 in October. That detail matters less than you'd think, but I mention it because the season had something to do with how quickly the nights got dark, and darkness was part of the texture of the job from the very beginning. By the time I clocked in for my shift at 10:30, the sky over the yard on West 74th was already a flat, depthless black, the kind you only get in the Midwest when the clouds sit low and there's no moon to speak of. I'd walk across the lot to my assigned coach, do my walk around with a flashlight, check the tires, check the mirrors, check the fare box, and by 11 I'd be pulling out of the gate with the interior lights on and the route number glowing on the head sign. The 87 was one of the overnight runs. Not the most popular assignment, not the least. It started downtown at Michigan and Wacker, looped south through the near-south side, threaded through Bronzeville and Woodlawn, then pushed west before curling back up through some of the quieter residential blocks between Garfield Park and Humboldt Park, and finally returned downtown by way of the medical district and the expressway service roads. The full circuit took about an hour and 40 minutes if traffic cooperated, which it almost always did at that hour. I'd make the loop 3.5 times before my shift ended at 6 in the morning. It was a long night, but it was predictable, and at the time I took the job, predictability was exactly what I was looking for. I'd been driving for the CTA for about 14 months before I moved to overnights. I'd spent most of that time on daytime routes, the 66 and the 49, where you dealt with packed loads during rush hour, people arguing about transfers, strollers blocking the aisle, wheelchair ramps that jammed in the cold. I didn't mind the work, but the volume wore me down. By midsummer, I was putting in requests for overnight shifts, and when the 87 slot opened in early October, I took it without hesitation. My supervisor at the time, a guy named Freddie Watts, who'd been driving for 22 years, told me the overnight would either fix me or finish me. He said it with a kind of affection that I appreciated, even though I didn't fully understand what he meant. The first few weeks were an adjustment, but not in the way I expected. The difficulty wasn't staying awake. I've always been a night person, and the rhythm of the route kept me engaged enough that drowsiness was manageable. The difficulty was the silence, not literal silence, because the bus itself was never quiet. There was the engine, the hydraulic hiss of the doors, the clunk of the kneeling function when I lowered the ramp, the little two-tone chime that played before each automated stop announcement. But the silence I'm talking about was the absence of other people's noise. During the day, you're surrounded by conversation, music leaking from earbuds, somebody on the phone. At night, if I had passengers at all, they were usually alone and usually quiet. They'd sit somewhere in the back third of the bus and stare at their phones, or out the window, or at nothing, and the ride would pass without a word exchanged. I learned quickly not to fill the silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just a different kind of space. I should describe the bus itself, because it was my environment for 8 hours a night, and it became very familiar to me in a way that matters later. It was a standard 40-foot New Flyer, diesel-electric hybrid, which meant the engine would cycle on and off depending on speed and battery level. The interior was the usual configuration: blue molded seats, yellow grab bars, a priority seating section up front with the fold-up seats for wheelchair access. The driver's area was separated from the passenger cabin by a plexiglass partition that came up to about chest height. On my left was the fare box, on my right was the dashboard, which had the speedometer, the route display, the radio handset, and a small digital clock that showed the time in green numerals. The clock was always there in my peripheral vision, just below the lower edge of the windshield, and I got in the habit of checking it more often than was probably necessary. At night, when you're making the same stops in the same order, and there's nothing to distinguish one lap from the next, the clock becomes your primary landmark. It tells you where you are in the shift more reliably than the streets do. The route had 43 scheduled stops. I know this because the automated announcement system would call them out one by one as I approached each location, a calm, recorded voice that said, "Next stop," followed by the cross street or landmark. "Next stop, 35th and State." "Next stop, Cottage Grove and 47th. The system was GPS triggered, so the announcement played when the bus reached a specific coordinate, regardless of whether anyone had requested the stop. If no one pulled the cord or pressed the yellow strip on the grab bar to ring the bell, and no one was visible at the stop, I'd roll through without slowing down. If the bell rang, I'd pull over, open the doors, wait, and close them again. Standard protocol, nothing complicated. The bell itself was a single tone, a short electronic chime that played through the overhead speakers and simultaneously lit up a small sign above the windshield that read, "Stop requested." The sign was red text on a dark background. It was positioned directly in my line of sight, which meant I couldn't miss it, which was the point. When someone wanted off, they'd press the strip, the bell would sound, the sign would light up, and I'd slow down for the next stop. Simple system. I'd heard it 10,000 times during my daytime shifts. It was one of those sounds that becomes part of the background of the job, like the door chime or the turn signal. I want to establish all of this because I need you to understand how ordinary the first few weeks were. I settled into the overnight shift, like a hand settling into a glove. I'd pick up my first passengers downtown around 11, mostly service industry workers heading home from restaurant or hotel shifts, and the load would thin out steadily as the night progressed. By 1 in the morning, I'd typically have 4 or 5 people on board. By 2, I'd sometimes have the bus entirely to myself. The emptiest stretch was usually between 2:30 and 4:15, when I'd make entire sections of the route without picking up or dropping off a single person. During those stretches, I'd just drive, hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, checking the mirrors every few seconds out of habit, watching the dashboard clock count forward. Chicago at 3 in the morning is a very specific place. The stoplights keep cycling through their colors, even though there's no one waiting at the intersections. The street-level shops are all dark, but the signs in their windows are sometimes still lit. These flat rectangles of neon or LED hovering in the blackness. Every few blocks there's a 24-hour gas station or a laundromat with its fluorescent tubes blazing, and these places look almost theatrical in their brightness, like stages set up in the middle of the dark city. The bus moves through all of this at its own pace, stopping at red lights, signaling turns, following the route as programmed. It doesn't care that the city is empty. It just does what it does. I first noticed the bell on a Tuesday. I'm fairly sure it was a Tuesday because Tuesdays were reliably the quietest nights, and I remember that on this particular night I had been completely alone on the bus since about 2:40. I was heading westbound on Congress, passing through the medical district, which was a long, straight stretch of road that ran past several hospital complexes. The buildings there are massive, but set back from the street, and at that hour they were mostly dark, except for the emergency department entrances, which glowed with that particular shade of institutional white. I was watching the road, and I was watching the clock, and the clock said 3:17, and the bell rang. I want to be precise about what happened, because in my memory it's very clear. The bell rang once, the standard single chime, and the stop requested sign lit up above the windshield. I glanced at the sign, then at the interior mirror that gives me a view of the passenger cabin. The bus was empty. Every seat was vacant. I could see the entire length of the cabin reflected in the mirror, and there was no one there. I looked back at the road, and I did what you're supposed to do. I slowed down and pulled over at the next stop, which was Congress and Ogden. I opened the doors. I waited. Nobody got on. Nobody got off. The air that came in through the open doors was cold and smelled faintly of exhaust and wet leaves. I closed the doors and pulled away. I didn't think much of it. Electrical glitches happen. The stop request system is wired throughout the bus with touch-sensitive strips on the grab bars and pull cords along the windows, and any of them can trigger the bell if there's a short or a loose connection. I'd seen it happen on other coaches. You report it in the post-trip inspection. Maintenance takes a look, and it either gets fixed or it doesn't. I made a mental note to write it up at the end of my shift. I did write it up. I used the standard defect report form and described the issue as stop request bell activating with no passengers on board. Occurred once during 3rd Circuit, approximately 3:17 a.m. I turned in the form at the end of my shift and went home. I slept, woke up in the late afternoon, ate something, and went back to work. That night I was assigned the same coach, number 4481, and the shift proceeded normally until, again, at 3:17, the bell rang. I was on a different section of the route this time. I'd run a few minutes ahead of schedule in the 2nd Circuit, so by 3:17 I was further north, somewhere around Kedzie and Chicago Avenue. The bus was empty, had been empty for about 20 minutes. The bell sounded. The sign lit up. I checked the mirror, confirmed no one was aboard, and pulled over at the next stop. Opened the doors, waited, closed them, pulled away. Same as before. 2 nights in a row. Same time. Different location on the route. I wrote it up again, and this time I mentioned the time specifically, noting that the malfunction had occurred at approximately the same time both nights. I assumed this would help maintenance isolate the issue. Maybe it was a timer-related fault in the electrical system, something cycling on a schedule. I didn't know enough about the bus's wiring to speculate further than that. The 3rd night, I was on a different coach, not 4481. I don't remember the number, but it was a different bus, a slightly newer model with a different seat fabric and a slightly higher-pitched door chime. I remember noticing these small differences as I settled in, and I remember, as the shift progressed and the bus emptied out, becoming aware that I was waiting for 3:17. Not anxiously, not nervously, just aware of it, the way you might be aware of an upcoming commercial break in a television show, a known interruption in the flow. I was heading southbound on State Street, passing through the loop, and the streets were as empty as they always are at that hour, the tall buildings forming a canyon of dark glass on either side, reflecting the bus's headlights back at me in pale streaks. The clock read 3:14, then 3:15, then 3:16. At 3:17, the bell rang. Same chime, same sign, same empty bus, different coach, different part of the route. I pulled over, opened the doors, waited, closed them, sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel and the engine cycling in the quiet. Then I checked the mirror again, confirmed I was alone, and pulled away. That was the night it stopped being a simple mechanical issue in my mind. I still considered that explanation. It was still the most reasonable one. But a second possibility had taken up a small amount of space alongside it, which was that the pattern was not coincidental. 3 nights, 3 different positions on the route, one of them on an entirely different bus, and the time was exactly the same each time. I'm not someone who sees significance in coincidence as a general rule. I don't have a superstitious mind, but I have an attentive one, and the repetition had my attention. I didn't write it up the 3rd night. I'm not sure why. It might have been because I felt that the first 2 reports were sufficient and a 3rd would seem excessive, or it might have been because I didn't want to draw too much attention to the pattern. Not because I thought something strange was happening, but because I wasn't sure yet what I thought, and I didn't want to commit to an explanation before I had one. I went home, slept, came back. Over the next week, the bell rang at 3:17 every night I worked. I worked 5 nights that week. 5 bells. The conditions varied. Sometimes there were passengers on board, sometimes not. When there were passengers, none of them reacted to the bell. I'd glance at the mirror and see someone sitting in the back, looking at their phone or dozing, completely indifferent. This wasn't unusual in itself. Passengers generally don't pay attention to the stop request bell unless they're the one who pressed it. But I started watching for any reaction, any flicker of awareness, and I never saw one. The bell would ring, I'd check the mirror, and whoever was sitting back there would continue doing exactly what they'd been doing, as though nothing had happened. I tried something on the 6th night. When 3:17 approached, I didn't pull over. The bell rang, the sign lit up, and I kept driving. I passed the next stop without slowing down. Nothing happened. The sign stayed lit for about 30 seconds, then went dark on its own, which was normal behavior. The system resets after a stop is passed. The bus continued on its route. The night continued. Everything was fine. But there was a small, odd thing. After I passed the stop without pulling over, the next automated announcement played about 15 seconds late. The GPS-triggered voice should have said, "Next stop, Pulaskian Division," as I approached the intersection. But instead it played when I was already past it, the voice speaking the name of a stop I'd already cleared. It could have been a GPS lag. Those happen sometimes, especially on the older coaches. I noted it, but I didn't make anything of it. The 7th night, I stopped. The bell rang at 3:17. I pulled over at the next stop, opened the doors, waited, and closed them. The automated announcements played on schedule for the rest of the shift. I don't know if those 2 things were connected. I don't know if the lag the previous night was caused by my decision not to stop, or if it was a separate technical issue. I only know that I noticed both things, and that noticing them made me more attentive than I wanted to be. I want to talk about the passengers for a moment, because they were a part of my nightly routine, and describing them helps me describe the texture of the work. Most of the people who rode the 87 after midnight fell into a few broad categories. There were the late shift workers, identifiable by their uniforms or lanyards, or the specific tiredness in their faces. There were the night wanderers, people who seemed to be riding the bus not to get somewhere specific, but to be in motion, to be enclosed and warm and going. There were the occasional drunks, usually harmless, usually asleep within 2 stops. And there were the regulars, people I saw often enough that I recognized them even though we never exchanged more than a nod or a good evening. One of the regulars was a woman who boarded at 47th and King Drive most nights around 1:15. She was maybe 50, heavy-set, always wearing a dark green coat and carrying a canvas tote bag from which the handle of an umbrella protruded regardless of the weather. She'd tap her card on the fare box, nod to me, and take the 3rd seat back on the right side, the same seat every time. She'd ride for about 25 minutes until I reached her stop in Garfield Park, and she'd exit without a word. I liked her. I liked her consistency. She was a fixed point in the shift, as reliable as any of the scheduled stops. Another regular was a younger guy, maybe mid-20s, who got on somewhere around Ashland and boarded heading south. He always wore earbuds and a dark hoodie, and he always sat in the very back, in the corner seat on the driver's side. He'd ride for maybe 40 minutes. He never acknowledged me, never made eye contact. I didn't mind. A lot of overnight passengers prefer to be invisible, and I respected that. Then there was a man I started noticing in the 2nd or 3rd week. He wasn't a regular in the same way as the others, because his boarding location and time weren't consistent. He'd appear at different stops on different nights, sometimes early in the shift, sometimes very late, and he'd ride for varying lengths of time. What made him noticeable was that he was very still. Most people fidget, shift in their seats, look at their phones, adjust their bags. This man sat without moving. He'd choose a seat, usually somewhere in the middle of the bus, and he'd sit with his hands in his lap and his eyes directed straight ahead, not sleeping, not reading, just sitting. I'd see him in the mirror, and he'd be in exactly the same position he'd been in 5 minutes earlier, 10 minutes earlier. It was the kind of stillness that you might not notice on a crowded bus, but on a nearly empty one it stood out. I didn't think he was threatening. He wasn't agitated, wasn't talking to himself, wasn't doing any of the things that make a driver's instincts kick in. He was just notably still. I assumed he was tired or preoccupied, or maybe just one of those people who can sit without moving, and I let it go. But I was aware of him. I noticed when he was on the bus and when he wasn't, and I began to notice, though this might have been selective attention, that he was never on the bus at 3:17. He'd board and exit before that time, or he'd board after it. I never saw him during the bell. I've been trying to describe all of this in a way that conveys how slow the realization was. There wasn't a moment where I sat up and thought, something is wrong. It was more like a gradual shift in the weight of my attention. The bell at 3:17 was strange, but it was also, in a way, just another part of the route. It happened. I dealt with it. The shift continued. The strangeness was durable, persistent, low level. It didn't spike. It didn't escalate. It just continued, night after night, until the fact of its continuation became the thing that unsettled me. About 3 weeks in, I mentioned it to another driver. His name was Carlos, and he'd been on the overnight rotation for about a year. We were in the break room at the 74th Street garage, both of us between shifts, eating vending machine food under the fluorescent lights. I brought it up casually, the way you'd mention a persistent check engine light. "You ever get phantom bell rings on the 87? I asked. Carlos looked at me over his bag of chips. "Phantom how?" stop request bell going off with nobody on board or nobody near the strip. He thought about it. Yeah, sometimes. These coaches are 20 years old, man. Wiring's held together with tape and prayers. It keeps happening at the same time, though, I said. Same time like how? Like 3:17, every night. Carlos chewed slowly. He had a way of considering things that I appreciated, a deliberateness that suggested he took questions seriously, even when they seemed minor. Same bus? He asked. Different buses, different nights, same time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, could be something in the route software. The schedule's got timing triggers built in, you know? If the system thinks you're supposed to be at a certain point at a certain time, it might fire off a stop request to sync up. Is that a thing? I don't know. I'm making it up, but it sounds right, doesn't it? It did sound right, and I let myself believe it for a while. A timing trigger in the route software. Something embedded in the schedule's code that activated at a specific moment to keep the bus on track. It was a plausible explanation. It was the kind of explanation that the CTA's aging infrastructure made easy to believe. Systems layered on top of systems, old code running beneath new code, ghosts in the machine in the most literal, technical sense. But there was something Carlos said after that, almost as an afterthought, that stayed with me. He crumpled his chip bag and tossed it at the trash can, missed, and said, the 87's been weird for a while, though. The route got changed a few years back, did you know that? They cut a section off the south end. Used to go further down, past Marquette Park, but they shortened it. Too few riders, I think, or maybe budget stuff. But the old route data's probably still in the system somewhere. I asked him what he meant by old route data, and he said he didn't really know. He was just guessing. He said sometimes the automated announcements would call out stops that weren't on the current route, and he figured it was leftover data from the old configuration that hadn't been fully purged. He said it happened rarely, maybe once or twice in his year on the route, and he'd reported it but never heard anything back. I thought about this for a while after Carlos left. The idea that the route had a previous version, a longer version that had been trimmed, was interesting to me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. It suggested that the bus's system carried a kind of memory, a record of stops it used to make, places it used to go. And if Carlos was right that old data could occasionally surface through the current system, then maybe the 3:17 bell was a remnant of the former route, a stop request that had been programmed into the old schedule and never fully removed. A ghost stop. This explanation satisfied me for about a week. During that week, I drove the route with a slightly different frame of mind. When the bell rang at 3:17, I'd pull over and open the doors and think of it as the bus remembering something it used to do, like a person absent-mindedly turning down a street they used to live on. It was an almost comforting thought. The system had a glitch. The glitch had a history. The history was mundane. Everything was accountable. But then I started paying closer attention to where I was when the bell rang, and the comfort eroded. The 87 route, as I said, had 43 scheduled stops. I knew their locations, their names, their spacing. I could recite them in order. And the bell at 3:17 did not always correspond to any of them. Sometimes it rang when I was between stops, in the middle of a stretch of road where there was no stop, scheduled or otherwise. The first time I noticed this clearly was on a night in early November. I was on Kedzie, heading north, between the stops at Kedzie and Arthington and Kedzie and Harrison. There was nothing at that point on the road. No shelter, no sign, no pole, no markings. Just a stretch of curb in front of a darkened two-flat. The bell rang at 3:17, and I pulled over out of habit, and I opened the doors to a spot where no one had ever boarded or exited the bus. A spot that wasn't on the schedule, and as far as I could tell, had never been on any schedule. I sat there with the doors open for maybe 10 seconds. The air outside was cold. The street was empty. The nearest streetlight was half a block away, and its light reached the bus only faintly, a thin wash of orange across the pavement. I closed the doors and sat there for another few seconds, hands on the wheel, engine humming. Then I looked at the dashboard clock. It read 3:18. I pulled away. That night I started keeping a log. Nothing elaborate, just a small spiral-bound notebook that I kept on the dashboard shelf beside my water bottle. Each night when the bell rang, I'd jot down the time, the location, and whether anyone was on the bus. I dated each entry. I did this every night for the next 3 weeks, and by the end of that period, I had a set of data points that I could review. Here is what the log showed me. The bell rang at 3:17 every night without exception. The location varied depending on where I was in the route at that moment, which varied depending on how the earlier parts of the shift had gone, whether I'd been running ahead or behind schedule. There was no single location that the bell favored. It was tied to the time, not the place. When passengers were on board at 3:17, the bell still rang, and no passenger ever acknowledged it, and no passenger was ever positioned near a stop request strip at the moment it activated. On 3 occasions, I noted that I was not near any scheduled stop when the bell rang. On one occasion, I noted that the automated announcement system announced a stop name immediately after the bell that I did not recognize. I wrote it down phonetically, something like Carruthers and Lowe. I looked it up later. There is no intersection of Carruthers and Lowe in Chicago, at least not on any current map I could find. I want to pause here and say something about what it's like to notice a pattern when you're not sure whether the pattern is real. There's a phase in the process where the most rational explanation is that you're manufacturing the pattern yourself, that you're seeing connections because you're looking for them. I was aware of this possibility. I'm not someone who's unfamiliar with the concept of confirmation bias, and I spent a not insignificant amount of mental energy during those weeks questioning whether my own attention was creating the phenomenon I was observing. Maybe the bell rang at other times too, and I just didn't notice because I wasn't watching for it. Maybe the announcement system glitched at other points, and I only caught the one that happened after 3:17 because I was listening for it. So I tested this. For 1 full week, I logged every bell ring, every announcement, every system event throughout the entire shift, not just at 3:17. I made tally marks on a fresh page each night. At the end of the week, I reviewed the data. The bell rang at various times throughout the shift when passengers requested stops as expected. The automated announcements played on schedule at every stop with no anomalies, and the bell rang without passenger initiation exactly once per shift at 3:17 a.m. I showed the log to Carlos. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Have you talked to maintenance about this?" I filed reports the first couple of times. And nothing. They didn't follow up. Carlos handed the notebook back to me. "I'd keep driving," he said. "The bell rings, you stop, You open the doors, you close them, you keep going. That's the job. If the system says stop, you stop. Don't make it into a thing. I appreciated the advice, and I think he was right in a practical sense. The job was the job. The bell was a part of the job, even if I didn't understand it. And for a while longer, that's what I did. The bell rang. I stopped. I opened the doors. I waited. I closed them. I continued. It was just another element of the routine, strange but manageable, like a crack in the sidewalk you step over every day without thinking about why it's there. But something shifted in early December, and I need to describe it carefully because it was subtle and I don't want to overstate it. The shift was this. I started noticing the timing of the bell before it happened. Not consciously, not deliberately. It was more like the way your body knows when a song is about to reach the chorus, a pre-awareness, a readiness. I'd be driving, and I'd feel a slight change in my alertness, a tightening of attention. And I'd glance at the clock and it would read 3:15 or 3:16 every time. My body had learned the rhythm. My hands would adjust on the wheel. My foot would ease off the accelerator. I'd be slowing down before the bell rang, preparing to stop without having made a decision to do so. This bothered me more than the bell itself. The bell was external. It was a sound produced by a system I didn't fully understand. But the anticipation was internal. It was my own nervous system adapting to a pattern, integrating it, normalizing it. I was becoming part of the routine. The bell rang and I responded, and the response was becoming automatic, and the automaticity of it made me feel less like a person making choices and more like a component performing a function. I tried to fight it one night. I deliberately didn't check the clock as the shift progressed into the early morning hours. I focused on the road, on the mirrors, on the physical task of driving. I turned the radio on, something I rarely did, and listened to a late-night talk show where someone was discussing property taxes with the calm, detailed focus that only exists on AM radio after midnight. I let the voice fill the cab. I didn't think about 3:17. The bell rang. I checked the clock out of reflex. 3:17. I pulled over, opened the doors, waited, closed them. The talk show host was explaining the difference between assessed value and market value. I turned the radio off and drove in silence. Around the middle of December, two things happened that I need to describe. The first was that the still man, the passenger I'd noticed for his unusual immobility, appeared on the bus at an odd time. He boarded at around 2:50 a.m. at a stop on Ashland, which was later than I'd seen him before. He tapped his card, didn't look at me, and sat in his usual middle section seat. I watched him in the mirror as I drove. He was, as always, motionless, hands in lap, eyes forward. I became acutely aware that 3:17 was approaching, and I realized I had never had a passenger on board at that time who I'd been specifically watching. The regulars I'd noted before, the woman in the green coat, the young man with the earbuds, they were always gone by then. But this man was still sitting there, and the clock was turning over. 3:15, 3:16. I could feel it, that tightening in my chest, that readiness. I looked at the mirror. The man was sitting exactly as he had been. His face was neutral. His hands were still. His eyes were directed forward, which meant they were directed at the back of my head, because he was sitting on the driver's side and looking up the center aisle. 3:17. The bell rang. The sign lit up. I looked at the mirror. The man did not react. He did not move. His expression did not change. He was sitting the same way he'd been sitting a minute earlier, 10 minutes earlier. The bell was a sound that happened in the same space as him, and he showed no awareness of it at all. I pulled over, opened the doors, waited, closed them. When I looked at the mirror again, the man was still sitting there. He rode for another 15 minutes, then pressed the bell himself, a second chime, and I let him off at a stop on Division. He exited through the rear door without looking back. The second thing that happened in mid-December was that I began noticing something about the route itself that I couldn't easily explain. On certain nights, after 3:17, the sequence of stops felt slightly different. Not dramatically different, not wrong, just slightly off, as if one stop had been added or one had been removed, and the spacing had adjusted accordingly. The automated announcements would play, the names would be correct, but the intervals between them seemed compressed or stretched. I'd arrive at a stop and think, that seemed faster than usual, or I'd be between stops and think, this stretch is taking longer than it should. I want to emphasize that I could not confirm this objectively. I didn't have a stopwatch running between stops. I didn't have a GPS tracker comparing my position to the official route. I had my sense of timing, which I trusted because it had been calibrated by weeks of driving the same route, and I had the dashboard clock. But the sense of discrepancy was real enough that I started paying attention to it, and paying attention to it made me less certain of my own timing, which made the discrepancy harder to evaluate, which made me pay more attention. It was a loop. I should tell you about a specific night, the one I think of as the pivot, although that might be giving it too much weight. It was a Thursday, December 19th. I remember the date because there was a Bears game that evening, and the last of the post-game crowd was still filtering through downtown when I started my shift. The early part of the night was busier than usual, which meant I was running behind schedule by the time the bus emptied out. By 2:30 I was maybe 10 minutes late, and I was working through the residential section of the route between Garfield Park and Humboldt Park, an area of wide, quiet streets lined with brick two-flats and the occasional church or corner store. The bus was empty. The streets were empty. The houses were dark except for the blue flicker of a television behind curtains here and there. I was paying attention to the clock because I was always paying attention to the clock, and I was calculating where I'd be at 3:17 based on my current pace. I figured I'd be somewhere around Chicago Avenue and Sacramento, a section of the route that ran past a strip of businesses, most of them closed at that hour, their roll-down security gates reflecting the bus's headlights in dull metallic streaks. At 3:14, the automated announcement said, "Next stop, Sacramento and Walton." Sacramento and Walton was a scheduled stop. I knew the intersection, but the announcement should have been, "Next stop, Chicago Avenue and Sacramento." Walton is a block south of Chicago Avenue. It was the wrong cross street. A small error, one block off, the kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention, and I noticed. I looked at the road. I was approaching Sacramento and Walton, not Sacramento and Chicago, Walton. The announcement had been correct in calling the intersection I was approaching. It was the route that was wrong, or rather, I was on a part of the route that didn't match my expectation. I should have been one block north, except the bus had been driving straight. I hadn't turned. I hadn't deviated. The route had delivered me to this intersection through the normal sequence of turns and straightaways, and yet I was 1 block south of where I should have been. I drove through the intersection. The next announcement said, "Next stop, Sacramento and Augusta," which was correct for the route as I knew it. And the stop after that was correct too, and the one after that. The sequence had reattached itself to the version I recognized, but for that one moment, at that one stop, the route had been slightly different, as if it had bent around something I couldn't see and then straightened out again. At 3:17, the bell rang. I pulled over, opened the doors. The cold air came in. I could see Sacramento Boulevard stretching ahead of me, a long straight line of asphalt under the streetlights, and there was nobody on it. I closed the doors, drove on. That night, I went home and looked up the old 87 route, the one Carlos had mentioned. I searched the CTA's website, which had archives of past route changes going back several years. I found the revision. In 2021, the 87 had been shortened, eliminating a southern extension that ran past Marquette Park. But the change had also adjusted several stops in the middle of the route, consolidating some, eliminating others. One of the eliminated stops had been at Sacramento and Walton. I sat at my kitchen table at 7:30 in the morning, still in my uniform, looking at a PDF of the old route map on my laptop screen. Sacramento and Walton, a stop that no longer existed, called by the automated announcement system at 3:14 a.m., 3 minutes before the bell, called correctly, accurately, as if the system had remembered a stop it used to know. I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed. In the days that followed, I found it harder to sleep. Not dramatically harder, not insomnia, just a slight erosion of the ease with which I usually dropped off. I'd lie in bed and my mind would replay the route, and I'd find myself mentally driving it, stop by stop, waiting for the point where something didn't match. This is a common experience for people who do repetitive work. Your brain continues to run the program even after you've clocked out. But the program my brain was running had a flaw in it, a discrepancy, and my brain kept reaching that point and stalling, like a record skipping. I started paying attention to the other drivers. Not directly, not by asking questions, but by observing them in the break room and the lot. I wondered if anyone else on the 87 was experiencing what I was experiencing, or if it was specific to me. But the 87 had a small rotation of overnight drivers, and most of them were quiet, professional people who didn't talk much about the work. Freddie Watts, my old supervisor, had once told me that the overnight drivers were a different breed, people who preferred the solitude and didn't need to process their shifts by talking about them. I understood that. I was one of those people, which is why it was strange that I wanted to talk about it, and stranger still that I didn't. Christmas passed. I worked Christmas Eve and Christmas night, both of them quieter than usual, the bus carrying only a handful of passengers all shift. The city had a different quality on those nights, a muted, held breath feeling, as if everything was paused. The decorations on some of the houses and storefronts were still lit, strings of colored lights along gutters and door frames, and they gave the dark streets a faintly festive cast that felt dissonant with the emptiness. The bell rang at 3:17 on both nights. On Christmas night, when it rang, I was passing a church on the west side whose stained glass windows were illuminated from within, blue and red and gold, and the light from the windows fell across the pavement in these long, colored rectangles and I closed them, and I continued. January was when the route started to feel different, in a way I can only describe as textural. The stops were the same, the streets were the same, the intersections, the stoplights, the landmarks. Nothing had changed in any objective sense, but the feel of the route had shifted. It felt longer, not dramatically, not measurably, but in the way that a familiar walk can feel longer when you're tired or distracted. The time between stops seemed to stretch. I'd be driving and I'd think, I should be reaching Pulaski by now, and I'd look up and I'd be 2 blocks short. Or I'd think, I've got a while before the next turn, and then I'd be at it. The route had the same structure but different proportions, like a reflection in water that preserves the shape but distorts the distances. I checked the dashboard clock compulsively. The clock was consistent. The clock always agreed with itself. When the clock said 1:45, I'd been driving for the amount of time that felt like 1:45. When the clock said 3:17, the bell rang. The clock was the one thing that didn't waver. But I began to wonder whether the clock's consistency was itself the problem. Not that the clock was wrong, but that everything else was adjusting to it. The stops, the announcements, the spacing of the route, all of it calibrated to the clock, all of it bending to accommodate a timeline that the clock enforced. And the 3:17 bell was the most visible expression of this calibration, the moment where the clock's authority was most explicit. I'm aware of how this sounds. I'm describing a bus route as if it were a living system with intentions, and I know that's not rational. Buses don't have intentions. Routes don't bend. Clocks don't enforce anything. But the experience of driving the 87 at 3 in the morning, night after night, month after month, was the experience of being inside a system that behaved with a consistency that felt, at times, less like engineering and more like insistence. The route insisted on itself. It insisted on its stops, its timing, its bell. And I, as the driver, was the part of the system that was supposed to comply. In late January, I had a conversation with the still man. This was unexpected. He boarded at his usual time and took his usual seat, and I drove in the usual silence. And then, at about 2:40, he stood up and walked to the front of the bus. He stood by the partition and looked at me, and I glanced at him in the mirror and then looked over my shoulder because he was close enough to address directly. "You drive this route every night?" he asked. His voice was quiet but clear. "Most nights," I said. 5 on, 2 off. He nodded. He had a thin face and dark eyes, and his expression was attentive without being intense, the face of someone who listens more than he speaks. "How long have you been on it?" "Since October." He nodded again. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly with the motion of the bus, one hand on the grab bar. Then he said, "The route is good late at night. Steady. You always know where you are." "That's what I like about it," I said. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I like about it too." He went back to his seat. We didn't speak again, and he exited at his usual stop about 20 minutes later. But his words stayed with me. "You always know where you are." And I turned them over in my mind as I drove the rest of the shift. Because the thing was, I did always know where I was. The route was as familiar as the hallway in my apartment. I knew every turn, every stoplight, every crack in the pavement. The problem wasn't that I didn't know where I was. The problem was that where I was didn't always seem to be where the route said I should be. Let me try to describe this more precisely. The 87 route, as published, follows a specific sequence of streets: Michigan to State to 35th to King Drive to 47th, and so on. I had this sequence memorized. I could draw it on a map from memory. And when I drove the route, I followed this sequence. I turned where the route said to turn. I stopped where the route said to stop. But on certain nights, especially after 3:17, the streets outside the window didn't quite match the route inside my head. The buildings were the same buildings. The signs were the same signs. But the distance between them fluctuated, and the order in which I encountered them occasionally felt not wrong exactly, but loosened, like a necklace whose clasp has come undone so that the beads can slide. I realize I should address the possibility that I was simply tired and that my perception was unreliable. I have considered this extensively. Overnight shifts are demanding, and fatigue degrades perception. This is well documented, and I don't dispute it. But I was managing my fatigue carefully. I slept on a consistent schedule, 6 hours a day, from 8 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon. I ate balanced meals. I limited caffeine to a single thermos of coffee at the start of each shift. I was, by the standards of overnight workers, well rested and well maintained. And the perception issues I'm describing were not random or generalized. They were specific. They were tied to the route. They were tied to the time. They happened after 3:17 and not before. In February, I requested a copy of the route's technical documentation. I went through the proper channels, submitted a form to the operations office, and a few days later received a thick printout that included the route schedule, stop locations, timing points, and GPS coordinates for each stop. I took it home and spread it across my kitchen table and studied it like a map of somewhere I'd never been, even though I'd been there 5 nights a week for 4 months. The timing points were what interested me most. A timing point, in transit terminology, is a specific stop where the bus is supposed to arrive at a specific time. If the bus arrives early, the driver waits until the scheduled time before proceeding. If the bus arrives late, the driver proceeds without waiting. Timing points keep the route on schedule. The 87 had 7 of them, spread evenly through the circuit. I noted their locations and their scheduled times for each circuit. None of the timing points fell at 3:17. The closest one was at 3:08, at the stop at Pulaski and Congress. The next one was at 3:31, at the stop at Sacramento and Chicago. Between 3:08 and 3:31, the route ran through a section with no timing points, a stretch of about 23 minutes, where the bus was, in a sense, unmoored from the schedule. It was supposed to be following its route, making its stops, proceeding at its normal pace. But there was no timing point to check it against, no scheduled arrival to verify. It was in the gap. 3:17 fell in the gap. I don't want to suggest that this discovery was dramatic or revelatory. It was, at most, interesting. It meant that the bell at 3:17 occurred during the part of the route where the schedule was least constrained, where the bus had the most freedom to deviate from its expected pace without being flagged by the system. Whether this was coincidental or meaningful, I couldn't say. But I noted it. I noted it carefully. March brought a change in the weather and a change in the light. The days were getting longer, which meant the early part of my shift was less dark, and the late part of my shift was also less dark, and the deep, total darkness that had characterized the winter months was receding. But the change was gradual, and at 3 in the morning it made no difference at all. 3 in the morning, was as dark as it had ever been. On a Tuesday in early March, the bell rang at 3:17, and I pulled over at what should have been the stop at Kedzie and Flournoy. But the automated announcement said, "Next stop, Carruthers and Lowe." I'd heard this name once before, back in November, and I'd noted it in my log. Carruthers and Lowe. Not a real intersection, not on any map, but the announcement system said it with the same calm, recorded certainty with which it said every other stop name, as if it were simply the next point on a route that had always included it. I opened the doors. The cold air came in. Outside, the street looked like any other block of Kedzie. 2 flats on both sides, parked cars, a fire hydrant, a bare tree. Nothing unusual. Nothing to indicate that this was a place called Carruthers and Lowe, because it wasn't. It was Kedzie and Flournoy, and the announcement system had called it something else, and I sat there with the doors open for maybe 15 seconds, looking out at a street that was simultaneously the street I knew and a street with a different name, and the two things existed on top of each other without resolving. I closed the doors. I pulled away. The next announcement said, "Next stop, Kedzie and Harrison," which was correct, which was normal, and the rest of the shift was normal, and I went home and I didn't sleep well. I looked up Carruthers in the context of Chicago streets and found nothing. I looked up Lowe and found that Lowe Avenue is a real street, a north-south residential street on the south side, nowhere near Kedzie. There was no reason for it to appear in a stop name on the 87's route. There was no connection I could find. But I kept looking, and eventually, through a deep dive into historical Chicago maps that the public library had digitized, I found something. In the late 1800s, before the city's street grid was fully standardized, there had been a road called Carruthers Lane in the area that later became part of the Garfield Park neighborhood. It appeared on an 1872 plat map as a short diagonal road connecting 2 residential blocks. By 1890, it had been absorbed into the grid and renamed. It no longer existed except as a line on a very old map. I sat in the library looking at the digitized plat map on a public computer, and I felt something that I can only describe as a kind of quiet vertigo. Not fear, not excitement, just the sensation of looking at something that shouldn't connect but does, and not being able to explain the connection. The bus's announcement system had called out a stop on a street that had been gone for over 100 years, and it had done so at 3:17 a.m. in the gap between timing points, on a route that had already shown me it remembered things it shouldn't. I want to tell you what I decided to do, and I want to be honest about why. I decided to keep driving the route. I decided not to file any more reports, not to tell Carlos, not to contact management, not to escalate. I decided this not because I was afraid of seeming irrational, although that was a factor, but because I had begun to understand that the bell at 3:17 was not a problem to be solved. It was a feature of the route. It was something the route did. And my job was to drive the route, to follow its instructions, to stop when it said stop and go when it said go. The bell rang. I stopped. The doors opened. The doors closed. The route continued. That was the job. And I was good at the job. I was reliable, punctual, safe. My supervisor gave me a positive performance review in early March. I hadn't missed a shift, hadn't had an incident, hadn't received a complaint. I was, by every measurable standard, a model overnight driver. The bell at 317 was not in the measurable standards. It existed in a space between what the route was supposed to be and what the route was, and I occupied that space 5 nights a week, and I had learned to be comfortable there. Comfortable. That's not quite the right word. Accustomed. I had become accustomed. The bell was part of my night the way the dark was part of my night, the way the empty streets and the cycling stoplights and the quiet passengers were part of my night. I stopped thinking of it as an anomaly and started thinking of it as a given. The sun rises, the bus runs, the bell rings at 317. These were facts of equal weight. But there was one more night I need to describe, the one that brought me to where I am now. It was late March, a Wednesday. Mild weather. The windows of the bus were slightly open, which they hadn't been all winter, and the night air coming through them was soft and carried the smell of rain, though it wasn't raining. The shift had been uneventful. A handful of passengers early on, then nobody. By 2:30, I was alone on the bus, moving through the West Side residential blocks on the 3rd Circuit. I was aware of 317 approaching. I could feel it in the way I always felt it, that tightening, that readiness. I was on Sacramento heading north. The clock said 3:14, then 3:15. I was between stops. The street was empty. The houses on either side were dark. At 3:16, the automated announcement played. Next stop, Carruthers and Low. I hadn't been expecting it. I'd been expecting the bell, not the announcement. The announcement had only played that name once before. I slowed down, not because I decided to, but because the bus was slowing down. The deceleration smooth and controlled, as if the system were bringing the bus to a stop on its own. The bus stopped. I hadn't pressed the brake. I want to be clear about that. My foot was hovering over the brake pedal, but not pressing it. The bus had stopped the way it sometimes does at timing points, an automated function that I'd heard about but never experienced on this route. The engine cycled down. The interior lights seemed to brighten very slightly, as they do when the engine goes quiet and the electrical load shifts. The stop requested sign lit up. The bell didn't ring. The sign lit up without the bell. This had never happened before. The sign and the bell are linked. They're triggered by the same circuit. You can't have one without the other. But the sign was on, and the bell hadn't sounded, and the bus was stopped in the middle of the block, and I was sitting in the driver's seat, with my hands on the wheel and my foot off the brake, and the clock said 3:17. The doors opened. I didn't open them. The doors of a CTA bus are controlled by the driver. There's a lever on the left side of the dashboard. The lever was in the closed position. The doors were open. Cold air came in. Not the mild March night air that had been coming through the cracked windows. Cold air, January air. The kind of air that has weight to it, that presses against your skin like a hand. I could feel it on my face and my forearms and the backs of my hands. I looked at the interior mirror. The bus was empty. I looked out the windshield. The street was empty. I looked out the open doors, and the street was the same street it had been a moment ago. Sacramento Boulevard, dark houses, parked cars, bare trees beginning to bud. But the air was wrong. The air was from a different month. I sat there. I don't know how long. The clock said 3:17 the entire time. Not 3:17 and 30 seconds, not 3:18, 3:17. The green numerals held steady. The clock, which had always been the one reliable thing, the one constant, was holding at 3:17 and not advancing. And then, very faintly, from somewhere outside the bus, or inside the bus, or from the speakers overhead, or from nowhere, I heard the bell. Not the electronic chime I'd been hearing for months. A different bell, a real bell. A small, clear, metallic sound, like a bell on a string, like a bell someone was holding in their hand and shaking once. It rang once and stopped. The doors closed. The engine cycled on. The clock advanced to 3:18. The warm March air returned through the cracked windows. The automated announcement played. Next stop, Sacramento and Augusta. The route continued. I drove the rest of the shift without incident. I completed the circuit. I returned to the garage. I did my post-trip inspection. I clocked out. That was 3 weeks ago. I have driven the 87 every night since then, and the shift has been normal. The bell rings at 3:17. The electronic chime, the usual one. The sign lights up. I pull over. I open the doors. I close them. I continue. The route is the same route it has always been. The stops are the same stops. The clock advances at the same pace. But something is different, and the difference is in me. I no longer anticipate the bell. I no longer feel that tightening at 3:15 or 3:16. I no longer check the clock compulsively as the hour approaches. And the reason I don't is that the bell no longer feels like an interruption. It feels like a heartbeat. It feels like a pulse in the route. A moment where the system breathes, and I breathe with it. It's not something that happens to me. It's something I participate in. I slow down. The bell rings. I stop. The doors open. The cold air comes in, or it doesn't. The doors close. I continue. And the route continues. And the night continues. And we are, all of us. The bus, the road, the clock, the bell, and me. Synchronized. I don't know what Carruthers and Lovey is. I don't know what rings the bell at 3:17. I don't know what the bus remembers, or why it remembers it, or what it means that I've become part of the remembering. I know that the route exists, and I drive it, and the bell rings, and I stop. I know that the gap between timing points is 23 minutes long, and that 3:17 falls exactly in the middle of it. I know that a street called Carruthers Lane existed in 1872 and doesn't exist anymore, except in the announcement system of a bus that runs through the space where it used to be. I know that on one night in March, the clock stopped and the doors opened by themselves, and a bell rang that wasn't the bell I knew, and then everything went back to normal, and I kept driving. I keep driving. The shift ends at 6. The sky lightens. The early morning passengers start to board. Sleepy-faced people with coffee cups and backpacks heading to jobs that start at 7. The bus fills up. The route becomes a regular route, busy and loud and unremarkable. I make my final stops. I return to the garage. I park the coach. I hand in my log. I go home. I eat. I lie down. I close my eyes. And before I sleep, in that last thin moment of consciousness, I hear it. Not with my ears, but with something else. Some part of me that is always on the route now, always driving, always approaching 3:17. The bell. Just once. And then I sleep.